Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Don Ebanks. I'm a member of the Executive Committee of the Cayman Islands Directors Association, and I'm here with Heather Smith, head of the Investments Supervision Division at the Cayman Islands Monetary Authority. And we're here to talk about the private funds law and the ongoing compliance obligations that those in the positions of governance as operators or directors of operators should be aware of. Heather, thanks very much to take the time to speak with us. I'm sure that your comments will be very useful for those in these important governance roles.
Thank you, John. Thank you for having me, and I think this discussion is quite timely. And as we continue to bed down the requirements of the Private Funds Act, actually that's a new little tidbit to share.
Okay,
I think now that we have a parliament, I think all of our legislation going forward are going to be called acts. So it's still something I'm adjusting to. It'll take me a while. I'll be the PFL for quite a while, I'm sure, before I remember it's the PFE.
Okay, thank you. So we thought we would start with a couple of straightforward yes or no FAQs. And we note that there are the sections 16 through 19 of the private funds law that talk about specific ongoing compliance requirements. And we've been asked, is there a transition period for those provisions?
Short answer is no. When laws are written, if there are going to be transitional periods, they have to be expressly outlined in the law. And in the case of the Private Funds Act, they are not included. And so essentially what that means is that from the point of commencement of that piece of legislation, there's a requirement, those obligations become crystallized. Mm-hmm. And certainly it would be the expectation of CIMA that entities are starting to assess their own policies and procedures and to determine, if not already in existence, how they're not going to incorporate these new requirements into their ongoing operations.
Thank you. And in the same vein, there were some rules that were issued. There was one on contents of marketing materials early in the summer, but in particular, there were rules on segregation of assets and calculation of net asset values for private funds. And those were issued by the Monetary Authority. Would those have a transition period?
Again, it would be the same situation in relation to regulatory measures. So unless a regulatory measure specifically includes a transitional provision, then again it becomes effective from the date of publication.
Okay, thank you. So I guess we can get into a few of the more detailed questions. I think in some cases where we've had discussions with folks about how to deal with this, people have perhaps assumed that because, for example, the manager has their own procedures, especially around valuation, for example, or the administrator has certain procedures, can we assume as the directors of corporate entities or directors of general partners for private funds that we're actually in compliance?
And again, I think that the answer would be that it would not be the appropriate approach to take to just make assumptions. We do recognize that in the respect of fund and their operations, there is a lot of delegation that occurs or reliance on the policies and procedures that are in place for a particular service provider to whom the functions have been outsourced. And certainly we do recognize that a lot of the regulatory measures are centered around or built around international best practices. So to a large extent, there will be some element of the requirements that's already present within the policy and procedures of a service provider. But certainly as an operator of a fund, it would be prudent to have that express confirmation through discussions with the service provider to ensure that these steps are in fact being taken in respect of the fund for which you are responsible, that have been where the day-to-day operations have been outsourced to a service provider.
Right, and I guess then it seemed that the right way to deal with things is to take some kind of action or document in some way what's being done at the fund level. So if the rule about calculation of net asset values is talking about a NAV calculation policy, should we have, for example, XYZ fund NAV calculation policy and have that approved by the board, for example?
I mean, that would certainly be the right approach because, again, each fund has its own governing body, and therefore policy and procedures should be specific to that fund. I mean, the same way in which funds produce their own offering documents and everything is branded with the name of the fund, and there's expectation that their policies now It may be that there are a group of funds that when you look across their policies and procedures, they are identical, because in considering the investment strategy, investment objectives, and other factors, it would make sense that they look very similar. However, to have one that's expressly specific to that fund would be appropriate. And so again, this is demonstrating that the fund's governing body has taken the time to consider the rules and requirements in the context of that fund's operation, not just taking a blanket approach.
Right. So if you had 10 funds that were drawing on the same sort of valuation approach, you could just have Fund 1, Fund 2, and so on, even if the content was the same, but you would show that by each fund approving, Fund 1, Fund 2, that they had demonstrated that they were in compliance.
Right. I mean, and again, this is helpful in situations where there are questions that are raised specific to that fund. So your ability to point to something that is specific to the fund does in fact help your argument if you're asserting in your defense that the fund did in fact take these steps. So being able to produce something that's formalized as a policy level for that fund would also help your cause.
And I suppose the policy point versus informational disclosures, for example, in the offering document or marketing materials, is maybe an interesting point, because we have been asked that the question, well, you know, if we do have some valuation language that's already in the marketing materials, can we just leave it at that? Does that seem like a reasonable approach?
I mean, again, it means it depends on what you mean by disclosure, because I mean, we've seen the contents of offering documents and marketing material run a gamut from just, you know, a couple pages to being very, very detailed. So if a fund has taken the time from the outset to essentially outline its policy step by step within its marketing material, and one could argue that it has taken sufficient actions. However, if it's merely a reference to the presence of a policy and there are not a lot of details there, to the point where if someone really wanted to understand the process, they could not merely go to the marketing material to find it, which would be, I think, would be probably less of the case than the expectation that there is something that exists that is more detailed. That would be the understanding. So to say you've disclosed it, then I guess it would depend on how much detail is there. Would somebody be able to walk away from reading the marketing material and have a good sense as to exactly what your evaluation process was? If so, then I think you've done enough. If not, then it would be prudent to consider having something more detailed as available.
And I suppose since the rule does require periodic review in order to effectively generate a policy that is binding, that requires such periodic reviews, and for example, the escalation, if there's a deviation from the policy that affects the reported NAV,
right.
You know, that sort of points you towards a policy document that's more procedural,
Yes.
rather than just a description.
There's a description, absolutely, that's correct.
Yeah, thank you. So actually that leads to a point that's related to what we discussed earlier about assuming things. Would it make sense for either the governing body, the operators, to do a reconciliation between, you know, what's in the private funds law for now, soon to be act, and the rules, and what exists, because some funds actually do have a valuation policy, and it is actually approved by the governing body, but of course these requirements are quite new, and we may not have yet actually done that reconciliation.
Yeah, I think for a lot of the operators out there, and certainly those that are directors as well, this will feel familiar because it's very similar to what we've just recently gone through with the changes to the anti-money laundering, countering finance and terrorism framework. Because in looking at AML-CFT changes, that was one of the requirements, to say the framework now introduced a lot of new changes and requirements, and while they were in many cases an enhancement to what was already being done, it did necessitate, you know, entities stepping back and looking at their policies and saying, are they detailed enough? Do they now meet the new requirements? So certainly with the introduction of any new regulatory measure, it would be an appropriate exercise to look at what you're currently doing and to consider that in relation to any new requirements that are now in place, and to determine what the changes are that need to be made. In some cases, you would already find that there's very little to do. There's also that whole consideration as to understanding your own operations and the applicability of the new requirements. It may be that there are certain measures that don't necessarily apply to you wholesale, or your approach is going to have to be slightly different, but certainly that reconciliation is advisable Because if it turns out that you're not doing something, then if you can demonstrate you at least gave thought to not doing it and can justify why you're not doing it, then that goes a long way towards, you know, having those more difficult conversations, because usually those conversations arise around something being determined to may have gone wrong.
Right. And I think you kind of alluded to a point which is I think quite important in my experience working as a director. It's contemporaneous documentation. So if you actually make, for example, a risk-based assessment that you will do something in perhaps a simpler way than a more complex fund might need to,
Right.
your thinking and your conclusion, you would want to document that at the time the decision was made.
Exactly.
That makes sense. And I think, just moving on, that we've certainly seen, maybe for some years, that we have in the private fund space these larger structures where you may have a Delaware fund, a Cayman fund, an Irish fund, and a Luxembourg fund, for example, in the real estate world, and other closed-ended investment strategies. We noted that for the rules, there's the rule around calculation of net asset values, rule on segregation, and we don't have one for cash monitoring. And given that we do have these structures where some of the funding vehicles are in Europe and subject to AIFMD, would it make sense that if you're already doing cash monitoring, that you would kind of conceptually align your operational approach? So if you already have an approach to cash monitoring because of the presence of structural elements in the EU, just to kind of follow through a similar process for the Cayman funds.
Right. And I think, Don, you've also made an important connection, which is to note that their rules are not in existence currently in everything that's in the law. So cash monitoring, as an example, is noted, outlined within the law, the Act, but it is there's not a rule specifically to that. So certainly what we've noted for a lot of entities that are multinationals operating in multiple jurisdictions, again, to a point that was made earlier, that a lot of what is in place is seeking to have an alignment of best practices internationally. So getting to a place where we're largely across the board in terms of how we do business, doing it in very, very similar manners, taking into account that there are going to be nuanced differences in various jurisdictions, type of operations, etc. But largely the principles remain the same. So some entities that then are in multiple jurisdictions have taken the approach, as you've noted, to say, okay, well, let's default to the highest standard. So in that way, we'll make our base standard the one that then ensures that if we're implementing it this way, we have then met the requirements of all the jurisdictions in which we operate, versus doing it jurisdiction by jurisdiction. So in that way, we're having to do changes. So again, that would be one approach. Or it could be simply looking at compliance within each jurisdiction based on what the specific requirements are. Certainly here in Cayman, we only have remit over what the Cayman requirements are as well. So that would be the standard in which we're judging. But if you are creating your own policies and procedures, it probably would make sense to say, I'll put in place procedures and an approach that then means that I have met the standards and requirements across the board.
Thank you. And one of the things that I sort of point out to people about the, especially sections 16, 17, and 18, is that there is no one way that you have to do things.
Yes.
But I think that sword cuts both ways, because if there are multiple avenues to compliance, just your earlier point about documenting your decision at the time, if later on someone asks, are you compliant, and you just wave your arms and say, well, sure, I'm compliant, but wait a second, did you make a decision at the time about whether or not you're using a third-party independent service provider, or the segregation or the disclosure and management of conflicts or potential conflicts of interest? That would seem to be a little bit problematic. Do you think it's better, again, especially from a governing body perspective, to say, right, we've been advised from the investment manager or investment advisor, this is how they've structured, and this is, so therefore this is how we can be compliant with these requirements? Right.
I mean, and again, I think this comes down to some fundamental steps, which is you are outsourcing your function, and you've gained comfort initially that what is being done or said to be done will meet the requirements of your fund based on its own risk profile. However, it would be advisable to periodically test and to see that what is said to be done is in fact being done. An ongoing monitoring mechanism would also be advisable, because again, that's what you're expected to do. So, whether that's going to be in the form of reports, whether that's going to be in the form of, monitoring certain transactions, whether that's going to require certain approvals being built into the process, whereby if it's being done on behalf of your fund, this is what you require of the service provider. I mean, again, I think that what you're getting at is to not have a wholesale reliance on what you're being told, to find a way of being able to verify that what is being said to be done is in fact being done. That would be the expectation.
Right, and actually that's interesting, because the next point that I thought would be good to discuss is very similar, which is that if, for example, the manager says, right, we're a large operation, and so segregation is the most appropriate approach to, for example, valuation. Here are our internal procedures that specify, that these people are on the valuation team, and these people are on the portfolio team that makes investment decisions, and these are the internal procedures that say that those two teams can't sort of cross-fertilize and do each other's work. Would that be sort of one of the ways we could document that sort of thing?
I mean, certainly, and again, it really comes down to the governance body assessment of, because one could argue that in order to have outsourced or to have a reliance or delegation, you have to come to some level of comfort around what's being done, and that would certainly mean that you've evidenced in some way that it is being done, and this does in fact happen. So I think it really comes down to you determining how much detail you want. Do you want to know the members of each of the team? Do you want to get into that, or is it going to be more spot checking around, in the case of this particular transaction, just getting a sense as to who was involved in it, and did the appropriate procedure take place as it should have? Because that's also another one of our findings, wherein very nicely documented procedures, but in reality they're not being adhered to. So that's really what it is that you're trying to get comfort with. Are they following their own procedures, and did they have to sell me something up front? But can I be assured that it's being done the way it said it should be done?
That makes sense. And of course, if we are going to check whether or not they're following segregation, we need to agree segregation is the approach that's being used in the first place.
Exactly.
Right. Thank you. Because of one of the things you mentioned earlier, that there's not a rule for everything. There's not step-by-step guidance for everything, single thing that we might think of. Some people might prefer to wait an extended period of time, like a year or two, so that someone can just hand them a sort of textbook for every possible question that they would have. Do you think that it's better to make your best efforts towards compliance as soon as possible, or to sort of put your feet on the desk and say, I'm just going to wait and see what happens?
Well, definitely, I'm going to advise that you go and make your best effort, because again, it is the view of the regulator, whether or not anyone agrees with us or not, that we're not seeking to implement practices that should not already be part of your operation. Essentially, what we do with each review and changes and enhancements to the framework is some stress tests what we've been doing. And a lot of times, the new requirement is in response to what we're seeing, to the changes within the industry, that we think now these particular considerations and safeguards are appropriate, because we're seeing an evidence of this type of activity. And so we want to ensure that everybody has considered it. So, it could be that your assessment, because you are already on top of it, and arguably, as a governing body of a fund, you should be ahead of the curve in terms of having considered your own risk on an ongoing basis. Have there been changes in the approach you're taking? Are you now going into certain other jurisdictions? Are you, the underlying investment, has that changed your strategy, everything else? And as it changes, you should be really enhancing and adapting your own governance structure to ensure that you have identified the risk, which is really all regulation is seeking to do. So arguably, you are ahead of the regulator, and in that case, so it should be merely a matter of saying, okay, there's no requirement in place, but we already consider that. It doesn't apply to us. Or yes, we were already doing that partially, all we now need to do is take this additional step. But to sit back and wait, there's really no one size fits all. It is a risk-based approach. That's going to be probably something that we all have heard quite a bit about in recent times. So it really does come down to that, because you're ultimately having to demonstrate that you do have in place the appropriate framework for your own operations. So, being able to say that you've done something and made an assessment, I think would certainly serve you well.
Yeah, so I think it's better to review, make decisions, document the decisions, and then perhaps someone could say, well, you need to improve a bit, but if there's nothing documented, then that's where the problem comes from.
Right. I mean, the easier conversations we have is when we're coming in and we're saying, we've looked at what you're doing and you certainly are well on your way. These are some areas that we feel you could enhance. That's a much easier conversation than ones that come in and we're saying, we don't have evidence that you're doing anything.
Right.
We can't see you're not doing, so those are always tougher conversations to have. So, ideally we want to be able to just help you, hopefully you see it as helpful, enhance what's being done, not have to tell you everything that's to be done, because that does give a very different picture of what the governance framework structure is like in that entity if we're having to come in and tell you things that should be basics that you should already know.
Yeah, understood. You shouldn't have to be the compliance advisor.
There you go. There you go.
Okay, so for specifically for the rule on calculation of net asset values, it talks about disclosing limitations and conflicts that are inherent in the NAV calculation policy. Would it be best to sort of recognize how that requirement and other requirements are being dealt with, for example, in minutes of a meeting or in resolutions, to say, these are the key components, this is how we're going to approach it, or this is what we have done?
Right. Again, I think it's a two-part process because, as you rightfully mentioned, the policy itself can speak to general acknowledgement of limitations and conflicts. But arguably, when they do arise, then there should also be a documentation of the process about how it was addressed in that particular instance. So, yes, this is generally what we would do. Then sometimes the question will be like, when it did come up, what did you do? So, evidencing what was done. Because again, the policy kind of gives you a generalized approach as to what will happen. And I think there's also going to be the question periodically as to, well, when it happened, how did it look? What did you do? And documenting it. So if you can show that it came up, there was a decision that was made, there was, even in particular, if it was a decision to allow something that on the surface of it is a deviation, then certainly those kind of decisions should be documented. Understood.
And one of the reasons, of course, why I think we both wanted to have this discussion is that compliance is a serious matter under the legislation, and there is a statutory fine. It's not an enormous fine that's within the law itself. I think that's section 4.2, but section 4.1 talks about ongoing compliance, and that section is specifically mentioned in the administrative fines amendment regulations as a serious breach. Failure to comply is a serious breach. Serious breaches attract a fine of 1 million Cayman Islands dollars, which is about 1.2 million US dollars, which is quite a substantial fine. I would assume that reflects the sort of seriousness of compliance from the perspective of the legislature and of the regulator. Right.
I mean, harkening again to the AML-CFT framework and the recent changes, I think we've all become a lot more familiar with the notion of effectiveness. And essentially what that then says is that, okay, you have policies and procedures in place, you have a legislative framework in terms of what persons are supposed to do, but are they actually doing it? And when they're not doing it, then that does have the ability to impact the entire regime, and in a negative way. So therefore, stressing the need for ongoing compliance means that we're stronger with each person who does what they're supposed to do. So when someone's not doing what they're supposed to do, certainly it's not the intention to throw the book at you for the first instance. And I think a lot of CIMA and other regulators have had a long history of seeking to work with entities, hence the reason why, for example, through our on-site inspection process, while applicable to the funds, but they do identify issues. You're usually given a period of time to rectify any breaches that are found and seek to get to a place where you are in compliance. If that's not happening, of course, or if the breach is especially egregious, then having the ability to levy fines as well, which send the clear message that compliance is a requirement, is something that I think is a necessary part of the framework.
Yeah. And again, if you are most of the way there,
Yes.
and you've done the best that you can do,
Right.
made decisions, documented them, then that attracts a very different posture from you compared to nothing at all.
Exactly. I mean, so certainly the conversations are very, very different when you can demonstrate that you've made your best effort. And in a case like that, then, like I said, we're having a whole different approach.
Right. And I suppose that sort of leads into the next point I was going to raise, which is just the general one. We've talked about some specific issues, but and we've talked about documentation. So in terms of sort of giving it your best shot effectively to try and comply with all of this, if you sort of systematically go through the different elements of the law or act soon to be, and the rules, and say, look, we've looked at it, we've looked at these different elements, these are the decisions we've made, this is how we will follow policies and procedures going forward, and document all of that. Would that seem to be the sort of reasonable approach or best practice?
Yeah, I mean, again, that is really what it is. I mean, we do recognize that funds operate differently, and so there is no one size fits all. And so the assessment individually is most effective in terms of your operations, what it is, how your fund is set up. So for you to look at what the requirements are, make the assessment, determine what would be necessary to be included if it's not already there to ensure compliance is certainly the right approach to take. And so I think it is really looking at your risks that you've identified. Again, that the expectation you've identified these risks. I mean, there really is not, for someone to come in and identify them for you is not the best starting point. It's something, it's really an assessment you should be doing despite what the framework may require.
Thank you. And I suppose this is a bit of a bonus question, because we've been focused mainly on private funds, but with respect to the rules around how valuation is done, and then the rule on segregation, there are similar rules for hedge funds that are registered under the mutual funds law. In terms of the sort of thematic approaches, decision making, documentation, risk-based approach, and so on, would it be advisable to take a similar approach in relation to the hedge fund rules?
Absolutely. I mean, the rules are very similar in some instances. I think it's a recognition that the fund products are slightly different, hence the reason, and they're certainly sitting under different pieces of legislation. So the need for us to have in place rules are specific to each, but the fundamental and the principles are the same. And therefore, if you do in fact are an operator for hedge funds, and then it is expected that in the context of each of these processes, that the same steps and assessment should be taken.
Okay,
yes.
Thank you. And I think that was all the questions that I had, but would there be anything that you would like to say to industry participants, especially in the governance space, about investment funds, how they're regulated, and what you would expect or where you would see things going in the future?
Right. I mean, this is a new piece of legislation, so certainly at this point, it is a bit of, bedding down process on both sides. I mean, as regulators, we have recently introduced a framework for the private funds, and there are rules and requirements that as we go through and we get more information about how they operate, and we're seeing more, then that will enable us to enhance the framework as well. So we do recognize that from the other side, this is a new the feeling of being regulated is new, and there were, in our view, a lot of the requirements were already in place. So it's now a matter of kind of refining what was done and to kind of aligning that with what the regulatory framework requires. So I see it as a learning process on both sides. I think discussions like these are very, very important, and in terms of gaining an understanding as the regulators to what you're seeing from a practical point of view, what are the implications for you in your day-to-day operations, and then for you to also understand where it is that we're trying to get at in respect of the regulations that have been put in place. So I see lots of ongoing engagement and dialogue as we seek to ensure that the sector continues to be robust, and that Cayman funds are used internationally and are relied on, and people feel confident in them, which is really what our objective is. We want confidence to remain in the jurisdiction, in the framework, in our product offerings.
Okay, thank you very much. We very much appreciate your time, Heather, and I certainly look forward to the engagement that you mentioned continuing. Thanks everyone. Appreciate your time, and hopefully you found this helpful.